The Temple of Ikor. The oldest known temple in Babylonia was that of Ikor at Nippur, sacred to Enlil. It was probably founded somewhere about 4000 BC, or even at an earlier date. Before the time of Sargon, we find the rulers of Nippur embellishing the temple there. The climate of the place necessitated frequent repairs, and because of occasional popular revolution, the fabric received considerable damage. We find Urban about 2700 BC, building a zikkurat in the temple area at Nippur, and a few centuries afterwards, Bursin repairing the zikkurat and adding a new shrine. Ikor saw numerous political changes, and when foreign dynasties ruled the land, its importance waned somewhat. Nevertheless, later alien rulers shrewdly saw the advantages of restoring its rather tarnished splendor, and we find several kings of the Kassite dynasty, 1400 BC. So far, honoring it as to place within its confines have a votive object from Elam, which had originally been placed in the temple of Ishtar at Erech, whence it had been removed by an Elamite conqueror about 900 years before. This was almost as remarkable as if the Stone of Dynasty, the Liafel in Westminster Abbey, were to be restored to its original seat in Ireland. The temple at Nippur was at this time dedicated to Bel before Miradak outs that deity. Almost every one of the Kassite rulers made more or less costly additions to the temple at Nippur, and from there several inscriptions. We could follow its history down to Assyrian times. About the 12th century BC, Ikor yielded its supremacy to Esaglia. It was sacked and partially destroyed until later restored by Assyrian monarchs, who conscientiously redecorated it and erected many new buildings within its area. However, during the Babylonian period, it was once more sacked by the order of the southern rulers, and at the end of the 7th century BC, its history comes to a close. Its site, however, did not lose its sanctity, for it was used as a cemetery and partially inhabited till the 12th century AD. The Brilliant House. This outlines the history of Ikor, will serve for that of many other Babylonian temples. The Temple of Shamash at Sippor, known as Babara, or the Brilliant House, can be traced back as far as the days of Naram Sin. Monarchs of the Kassite dynasty also restored this, but the nomadic tribes, whoever threatened the peace of Babylonia, made an inroad, scattered the priesthood, and destroyed the great idol of Shamash. It was nearly 500 years after this that the Brilliant House was restored to its former glory by Nabu-Baladan. Nebuchadrezzar rebuilt positions of the temple, as did the last king of Babylonia, Nabonidus, who scandalized priests of Babylon by his preference for the worship of Shamash. Or, the Moon City. We shall remember that one of the principal centers of the cult of the moon was at Ur, the city whence came Abraham, the patriarch, and probably he was originally a moon worshipper. Another such center of lunar adoration was Haran. These places were regarded as especially sacrosanct, as the moon cult was more ancient than that of the sun and was therefore looked upon with a greater degree of veneration. Both of these cities possessed temples to Sin, the moon god, and in the astrology and stellar observation were enthusiastically carried on. Haran was more than once overrun by the fierce nomadic tribes of the desert, but its prestige survived even their destructive tendencies. The Temple of Iana at Erech, dedicated to Ishtar, was one of the most famous sanctuaries in Babylonia. It is alluded to in one of the creation legends and the temples at Nippur as the bright house of the gods. The Twin Temples. The temples of Miradak at Esaglia and that of Nabu at Izaida were inseparably associated, for a visit to one practically necessitated a visit to both. An original rivalry between the gods had ended in a species of amalgamation, and together they may be said to have symbolized the national religion of Babylonia. Indeed, so great was their influence that it could scarcely be overestimated. The theological thought of the country emanated from the schools which clustered around them, and they were the great literary centers of Babylonia and thus the progenitors of Assyrian culture. Temples as banks. It was perhaps typical of the race that its places of worship should gradually become great financial centers and the nuclei of trade and usury, heavily endowed as they were by the kings of Babylonia and Assyria, and boasting immense wealth in lands, subsidies, and slaves. They also had at their command an army of workmen and laborers. However, their doctors were also bankers and moneylenders, buyers and barterers of produce and manufactured of every kind, estate agents, and men of commerce generally. Sacred objects of every kind were on sale in the temple precincts, idols, votive offerings, amulets, and so forth. With that object did the priesthood of Babylonia pursue a commercial career. It could scarcely have been one in which personal gain bulked largely, as the personal temple swallowed up all the profit. The cost of upkeep of such shrines must have been enormous, and when we think of the gorgeous nature of their interiors and the costly character of the rich vessels and altars with which they were equipped, we can marvel no longer at what appears degrading and unnecessary commerce on the part of their priesthood. Feast and festivals. Babylonian religious festivals were, as a rule, periods of jubilation and rejoicing. Each god had his day of the festival in the calendar. The first day of the year, or Zagmuka, was sacred to the goddess Bo. Gudea, who had made Ningursu his favorite, attempted to work him into the festival by uniting him in marriage with Bo, and he offers her marriage gifts on New Year's Day. Nevertheless, later, the Zagmuku was transformed into a festival to Miradak. The circumstance that it was celebrated in the first month of the year shows that it did not originally belong to Miradak, whose mouth was Marcheshon, the eighth. However, it is eloquent of his popularity that the great New Year's feast should have been dedicated to him. It seems to have lasted for at least 10 or 12 days. As has already been described, the union of Nabu and Miradak, father and son, was solemnly celebrated, Nabu piously paying a visit to his father's sanctuary. The other gods were supposed to assemble in the spirit in Meradak's temple to witness the ceremony, and afterwards, the priests of Meradak escorted the idol of Nabu back to its shrine themselves, carrying the image of their deity. To behold this festival celebrated with all possible magnificence, people flocked from all parts of Babylonia. The king, approaching the status of god, seized its hand in tokens of covenant, and in later times Assyrian monarchs, in order to legitimize themselves as rulers of Babylonia, went through this ceremony, which came to be recognized as duly fulfilling their claims to sovereignty in the southern land. But whereas they went through the ceremony once only, the kings of Babylonia celebrated it annually with the intense possible devotion. The Chambers of Fate. On the 8th day of the festival, all the gods were thought to assemble in Meradak's Chamber of Fates, to hearken to Meradak's decree concerning the fates of men for the ensuing year. This great apartment was regarded as the reproduction of the interior of the great mountain wherein the gods met in council, just as the ziggurat was thought to typify that mountain itself. It was situated in a peculiar portion of the mountain known as the Ubshu Kena, and among its sacred names is one which may be translated brilliant chamber, which shows that it must have been lavishly decorated. Ubshu Kena, or Upshuki Naku, must be carefully distinguished from the heaven, proper of the Babylonian gods. It is situated in the east, in the mountain of the shrine, not far from the edge of the world, where the waters of the great deep bounded it. It is in fact the brilliant chamber where the sun takes its rise. Lamentation rituals. On the occasion of any national or popular disaster, such as defeat in war, the appearance of pestilence, or an eclipse of the sun or moon, a certain formula of lamentation was gone through, which was thought to have the effect of lessening or averting the malign influence of evil powers, or the punitive measures of an angry god. This formula varied, of course, with the deity or demon who was considered to have caused the calamity. Many of these ancient lamentations are written in the Sumerian tongue, which witnesses to their great antiquity. From them, it would seem that the Babylonians thought if the people had in any way sinned, the gods averted their faces from them, and departing from their neighborhood, left them prey to calamities of all kinds. A definite ritual accompanied these formulas. one of the provisions of which was fasting and purification ceremonies of an elaborate nature were also celebrated by the priests, probably in the hopes of symbolically washing away the sin which had so offended the gods. The formula most in use with these proprietary ceremonies was obtained in the sacred city of Nippur, practically in the Temple of Ekur. The monotony of these laments is typical of ancient Semitic worship. They describe the disasters that have occurred and piteously beg the gods may be appeased. Again, pursuing them does a bright line or a picturesque phrase capture the eye and fire the imagination. A paraphrase of one of them may characterize the whole. The god Enlil, the shepherd of the dark-headed people, is implored to return to his city. He is entered by the various names of his godhead, such as Lord of Lands, Lord of the Faithful Word, Lord of Self-Created Vision, and so forth. Each separate part of the temple area is alluded to request that he return the Great Gate, the storehouse, and other religious departments. A touching domestic picture is drawn of deserted homes in the city, where the woman could say to her young husband, "My husband," where she could say to the young child, "My child," where the maiden could say, "My brother," where the little girl could say, "My father." There the little ones perish, there the great perish. In her banqueting hall, the wind holds reveal, her streets are desolate. From some of the texts, it would appear that the supplements were ignorant of the sins they had committed. And many so-called penitential psalms are extant which the stricken one appeals fervently to the gods to release him from the burden of his unknown sin, and he is unable to restrain himself. He laments earnestly and begs through priests for divine mercy. These appeals always end in the same way, that is, in the pious hope that the heart and liver of God may be appeased. With the Babylonians, as with the modern Armenians, to whom they are perhaps related, the liver was regarded as the seat of the emotions. Occasionally, a higher intellect and ethical plane are reached by these prayers. Men, says one of them, are blind. Which of them knows anything? They do not even know good from evil. God is fervently petitioned not to cast his servants off. He is in a deep morass, and he earnestly prays that the deity may take him by the hand, may change his sin to grace, and permit the wind to carry off his transgressions. The terror of eclipse. The terror of eclipse. The terror of the sun or moon's eclipse was a very real one to the ancient Babylonians. The tablet with the history of the 7 evil gods or spirits, though much mutilated, gives us a hint of the attack made by them upon the moon. They dwelt in the lower part of heaven and were rebellious in the heart. Shaped like leopards, serpents, and angry beasts of prey, they went from city to city on the wings of an eagle wind, destroying and smiting. Furthermore, into the heaven of Anu they burst. But Bel and Ea took counsel and set Sin the moon, Shamash the sun, and Ishtar the planet Venus in the lower part of heaven to govern and control it, along with Anu. No sooner had this been accomplished than the 7 evil spirits fiercely attacked the moon god. However, Bel saw the peril of sin and said to his attendant, the god Nusku, "Carry word of this to the ocean, to the god Ea." Ea heard the message and called his son, the god Miradak. "Go to my son Miradak," quoth he. "Enter into the shining Sin, who in heaven is greatly beset and expels his enemies from heaven." It is impossible to decipher the context from the mutilated remains of the tablets, but we may take it for granted that the pious efforts of Miradak were rewarded with success. An eclipse to the most primitive people means that the sun or moon god has either met with disaster or has withdrawn his face from his worshippers. The monthly waning of the moon made the ancients believe that it would be entirely blotted out unless God was pacified. Thus, if no eclipse took place, it was considered that the efforts of the priests and people had prevailed. Otherwise, they were held to have failed, and panic ruled supreme. In a certain prayer, Sin is adjured not to withhold his face from his people. The day of the monthly disappearance of the moon is called a day of distress, but a season of jubilee followed upon the advent of the new moon the next day. The temple gods. Ningursu. Gursu was part of the city of Lagash, and the name Ningursu means Lord of Gursu. Gods frequently had lordship over a city quarter, one of the best-known instances of this being that of Huitzilopochtli, who ruled over the part of Tenochtitlan called Mexico, which afterward gave its name to the entire community. Gursu had originally been a city itself and become merged into Lagash, so its god was probably of ancient origin. Ningursu is frequently alluded to as the warrior of Bel, he who broke through the hostile ranks to aid the worshippers of the great god of the netherworld. Like many combatant deities, however, he presided over local agriculture, and in this connection he was known as Shulgur, god of corn heaps. He is even identified with Tammuz. Bu. In ancient inscriptions, especially those of Gudea, Urbu, and Uru again, the goddess Bu is alluded to as the great mother of humankind, who restores the sick to health. She is called chief daughter of Anu and seems to play the part of a fate to some extent. She also has an agricultural side to her character. Gudea was especially devoted to her, and has left it on record that she filled him with eloquence. Her temple was at Uruazaga, a quarter of Lagash, and as the goddess of that neighborhood, she would of course have come into close contact with Ningursu. Indeed, she is spoken of as his consort, and when Uruazaga became part of Lagash, Bu was promoted as a titular goddess of that city and designated Mother of Lagash. She has been identified with the primary watery depths, the primitive chaos, and this identification has been found on the similarity between the name Bu and the Hebrew buhu, the word for chaos. But the proof wanting to support the conjecture, a closely allied form of her seems to be Gatumdug, a goddess who probably has a common origin with Bu, and who currently is in some manner connected with water, perhaps with the clouds. Nanar. Nanar was the moon god of Ur, the city whence came Abraham, and with that place he was connected much as was Shamash with Sippur, that is to say, Ur was his chief but not only his center of adoration. Why he came to have his principal seat at Ur, it would be difficult to say. The name Ur signifies light, so it may be that a shrine dedicated to Namar existed upon the site of the city and constituted the nucleus. In Babylonian mythology, the sun was regarded as the offspring of the moon, and it is easy to see how this conception arose in the midst of a race prone to astronomical study. In all civilizations, the lunar method of computing time precedes the solar. The moon phases are regarded as more trustworthy and more easily followed than the more obscure changes of the brighter luminary. Therefore, a greater degree of importance was attached to the moon in very early times than to the sun. The moon is usually represented on Babylonian cylinders as bearing a crescent upon its head and wearing a long, flowing beard described as the color of lapis lazuli, much the same shade as his beam processes in warmer latitudes. Nanar was frequently alluded to as the heifer of Anu because of the moon's horns at a certain phase. Many monarchs appear to have delighted in the upkeep and restoration of his temple, among them Nur-Ramman and Sin-Idina. Nanar in decay. As happens to many gods, Nanar became confounded with some earthly hero, was even alluded to as a satrap of Babylonia under the Median monarch Artios, a personage unknown to history. Titius hands down to us a very circumstantial tale concerning him as follows. There was a Persian of the name Parsondes in the service of the king of the Medes, an eager huntsman and an active warrior on foot and the chariot, distinguished in council and the field, and of influence with the king. Parsondes often urged the king to make him satrap of Babylonia in the place of Nanaros, who wore women's clothes and ornaments, but the king always put the petition aside, for it could not be granted without breaking the promise which his ancestors had made to Bellicis. Nanaros discovered the intentions of Parsondes, sought to secure himself against them, and took vengeance. He promised great rewards to the cooks in the king's train if they succeeded in seizing Parsondes and giving him up. One day, Parsondes, in the heat of the chase, strayed far from the king. He had already killed many boars and deer when the pursuit of a wild ass carried him to great distance. Finally, he came upon the cooks, who were occupied in preparation for the king's table. Being thirsty, Parsondes asked for wine. They gave it, took care of his horse, and invited him to take food, an invitation agreeable to Parsondes, who had been hunting the whole day. He bade them send the ass he had captured to the king and tell his servants where he was. Then he ate of the various kinds of food set before him and drank abundantly of the excellent wine, and at last asked for his horse in order to return to the king. Nevertheless, they brought beautiful women to him and urged him to remain for the night. He agreed, and as soon as, overcome by hunting, wine, and love, he had fallen into a deep sleep, the cooks bound him and brought him to Nanaros. Nanaros reproached Parsondes with calling him an effeminate man and seeking to obtain his satrapy. He had the king to thank that the satrapy granted to his ancestors had not been taken from him. Parsondes replied that he considered himself more worthy of the office because he was more manly and more useful to the king. However, Nanaros swore by Bel and Mylitta that Persondes should be softer and whiter than a woman, called for the eunuch who was over the female player and bade him shave the body of Persondes and bathe and anoint him every day. But women's clothes on him, plait his hair after the manner of a woman, paint his face, and place him among the women who played the guitar and sang, that he might learn their art. This was done, and soon Persondes played and sang better at the table of Nanaros than any of the women. Meanwhile, the king of the Medes had caused search to be done everywhere for Persondes, and since he could nowhere be found and nothing could be heard of him, he believed that a lion or some other wild animal had killed him when out hunting and lamented for his loss. Persondes had lived for 7 years as a woman in Babylon when Nanaros caused a eunuch to be scourged and grievously maltreated. This eunuch Persondes induced by large presents to retire to Media and tell the king the misfortunes which had come upon him. Then the king sent a message commanding Nanaros to give up Persondes. Nanaros declared that he had never seen him. Nevertheless, the king sent a second messenger to put Nanaros to death if he did not surrender Persondes. Nanaros entertained the king's messenger, and when the meal was brought, 150 women entered, of whom some played the guitar, while others blew the flute. At the end of the meal, Nanaros asked the king's envoy which of all these women was the most beautiful and played the best. The envoy pointed to Persondes. Nanaros laughed long and said, "This is the person whom you seek," and released Persondes, who on the next day returned home with the envoy to the king in a chariot. The king was astonished at his sight and asked why he had avoided such disgrace by death. Persondes answered, "In order that I might see you again, and by you execute vengeance on Nanaros, which could have never been mine had I taken my life." The king promised that his hope should be realized as soon as he came to Babylon. However, when he came there, Nanaros defended himself on the ground that Persondes, though in no way injured by him, had mangled him and sought to obtain the satrapy over Babylonia. The king pointed out that he made himself judge in this case and had imposed a punishment of a degrading character. In 10 days, he would pronounce judgment upon him for his conduct. In terror, Nanaros hastened to Mitrapernes, the eunuch of great influence with the king, and promised him the most liberal rewards, 10 talents of gold and 100 talents of silver, 10 golden and 200 silver bowls, if he could induce the king to spare his life and retain him in the satrapy of Babylonia. He was prepared to give the king 100 gold, 1,000 talents of silver, 100 golden and 300 silver bowls, and costly robes with other gifts. Persondes also should receive 100 talents of silver and costly robes. After many entreaties, Mitrapernes persuaded the king not to order the execution of Nanaros, as he had not killed Persondes, but to exact from him the compensation he was prepared to pay Persondes and the king. Nanaros in gratitude threw himself at the feet of the king, but Persondes said, "Cursed be the man who first sought gold among men. For the sake of gold, I have been made a mockery to the Babylonians." It is impossible to say what the mythological meaning hidden in the tale may portend. We have the moon god attempting to feminize an unfortunate enemy. Does this mean that Persondes came under the influence of the moon god? That is, that he became a lunatic. Erelu or Ereshkigal. The deities of the underworld, of the dead region, are usually of latter origin than those of the heavens. They are frequently the gods of an older and discredited religion and are relegated to the cold shapes of opposition, dwelling there just as the dead are supposed to dwell in the grave. A legend exists regarding Erelu, which was discovered among other texts at Tel El Amarna. The story goes that the gods once gave a feast to which they invited Erelu, apologizing at the same time that they were unable to go down to her and regretting that she could not ascend to them. They requested her to send a messenger to bring her the viands, which fell to her share in their dilemma. She complied with the request, and when the messenger arrived, all the gods stood up to do him honor for his mistress' sakes, all save Nergal. The messenger acquainted Erelu with this small and greatly enraged, and she sent him back to the dwelling of the gods to ask the delinquent might be delivered into her hands, so she might slay him. The gods, after some discussion, requested messengers to take back him who had offended the dark goddess, and in order that the envoy might the more easily discover him, all the gods were gathered together. Nevertheless, Nergal remained in the background. His absence was discovered, however, and he was dispatched to the gloomy realm of Erelu. However, he had no mind tasting death. Indeed, Erelu found the tables turned, for Nergal, seizing her by the hair, dragged her from the throne and prepared to cut off her head. She begged to be allowed to speak, and upon request being granted, she offered herself as a wife to her conqueror, along with the dominion over which she held sway. Nergal assented to her proposals, and they were wed. Nergal is the sun that passes through the gloomy underworld at night, just as does Osiris, and in this character, He has to conquer the power of death and grave. It is rare, however, to find the sun hero allying himself by marriage to one of the infernal powers. Although in the Central American Popol Vuh, one of the explorers to the underworld weds the daughter of one of its overlords, and Persephone, the corn goddess, is forced to become the spouse of the Lord of Hades. Dagon. Dagon, alluded to in the scriptures, was like Owens, a fish god. Besides being worshipped in Erech and its neighborhood, he was adored in Palestine and on occasion among the Hebrews themselves. Nevertheless, it was in the extreme south of Palestine that his worship attained its chief importance. He had temples at Ashdod and Gaza, and perhaps his worship traveled westward along with that of Ishtar. Both were worshipped at Erech, and where the cult of one penetrated, there would likely be found the rites of other. Dagon, his name, sea monster, upward man, and downward fish, as Milton expresses it, affords one of the most dramatic instances in the Old Testament of the downfall of a usurping idol. And the Palestines took the Ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer onto Ashdod. When the Palestines took the Ark of God, they brought it into the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon. And when they of Ashdod arose clearly on the morrow, behold, Dagon was fallen upon his face to the earth before the Ark of the Lord. Moreover, they took Dagon and set him in his place again. And when they arose early on the morrow morning, behold, Dagon was fallen upon his face to the ground before the Ark of the Lord. And the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off upon the threshold. Only the stumps of Dagon was left to him. Therefore, neither the priests of Dagon nor any that come into Dagon's household on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod unto this day. But the hand of the Lord was heavy upon them of Ashdod, and he destroyed them and smote them with emerods, even Ashdod and the coast thereof. And when the men of Ashdod saw that it was so, they said, The ark of the God of Israel shall not abide with us, for his hand is sore upon us, and upon Dagon our God. Thus in the Bible story, only the stump or fishtail of Dagon was left to him. In some of the Ninevite sculptures of this deity, the head of the fish forms kind of a mimicry of the head of the man, while the body of the fish appears as a cloak or cape over his shoulders and back. This is a sure sign to the mythological student that a god so adorned is quitting the animal for the human form. Nirig or Enu Restu. This deity is alluded to in an inscription as the eldest of the gods. The kings of Assyria especially favored him, and we find his name entering into the composition of several of their texts. In a certain poem, he is called the son of Bel, and is described as being made in the likeness of Anu. He rides, it is said, against the gods of his enemy in a chariot of lapis lazuli, and his onset is full of fury of the tempest. Bel, his father, commands him to set forth for the temple of Bel at Nippur, where Nusku, the messenger of Bel, meets him, bestows a gift upon him, and humbly requests that he will not disturb the god Bel, his father, in his dwelling place, nor terrify the earth gods. It would appear from this passage that Nirig was on the point of taking the place of Bel, his father, but that he ever did so is improbable. He is also a god of war, as a deity of the storm, but he was the seed scatterer upon the mountains. Therefore, he also had an agricultural significance. It is strange that in Babylonia, Tempest gods possess the same functions and attributes, those of war and agriculture, as do rain or thunder, rain thunder, or wind and rain deities elsewhere, a circumstance which is eloquent of the power of climatic conditions in the manufacture of myth. In Mesopotamia, a fierce sandstorm must have given the people the idea of a savage and intractable deity, destructive rather than beneficent, as many hymns and kindred texts witness.